Thanks for joining me. Today we have a lot of ground to cover. I've had many questions about the modern run of bolt-action rifles, and I don't have them all on the table. I'm waiting for a Savage Access and some others. But I do have a Remington 783, a Ruger American, and a Tikka T3. And I included the T3. It's not really a cheap rifle anymore, I wouldn't say that. But it started out that way, and it may be kind of the gold standard for the new way of building bolt-action rifles. So I think we should just get right into the video. And this is the stock of the Ruger American, and this video will rely heavily on the expertise of the camera crew and the lighting people. So you can see what Ruger did. Here are the recoil lug embedding blocks are here and here, and the forend is reinforced by these cross members, and altogether the Ruger stock is pretty rigid. They included the trigger guard in the design of the stock, so that's a saving, and you'll see how that ties in a little later. And the magazine recess is self-evident there. So I don't know how much it weighs. I mean, none of these synthetic stocks feel all that good. They all feel cheap. But that's just a feature of the material as opposed to the function. And here's the Tikka T3, and you can see the Ruger has bedding blocks forward and aft, and here we have only one on the Tikka T3. I'm not pointing that out as a inadequacy. To the contrary, I think everybody by now knows that T3 is an excellent rifle. And I'll just make an exception. You can see, I'll flip around the T3 action. So this recoil lug here, which is in the stock, fits into this mortise here on the action. That's how that works. If you're used to Mauser actions, of course, the recoil lug sticks out, and on the Remington 700 it would be about here. Anyway, that was just a footnote because I tend to forget things. So we've got the two stocks, Tikka T3, the Ruger American, and here's the Remington 783. Now, some of you have written me. No one had anything really horrible to say about the 783. Some people were concerned about the trigger, but I'm not aware of there being any real reason for concern. They seem to be fine. And you can see they talk about pillar bedding on the 783. So this is the so-called pillar bedding. When I say so-called, I'm not trying to be disparaging. I'm just pointing out that there's not much to pillar bedding. We've got two aluminum posts, and I'm assuming they make good contact with the action. A couple of things I noticed is that the 783, the bedding screws are on the front receiver ring and at the very back of the tang. Same with the Tikka T3. You can see how far apart they are. And Ruger opted for screws right there and there, so more in the middle. And for all the gun making people out there, I'm sure you've seen actions flex over this distance if you tighten this screw down and then bear down on the back screw. I'm not saying that happens with these actions. These are very rigid actions, but it is possible that there is flex. So maybe Ruger decided by placing the screws here, you accomplish everything that you need to, which is fastening the action to the stock. Plus you handle recoil, in a sense, 4 ways with the Ruger. So which stock to me is technically the most impressive? I would say the Ruger American. This stock twists. I'm not going to try to show you because I'll mess up the video, but I can twist this stock of the 783 easily in my hands. Anybody can. That doesn't mean it's a bad stock. I'm just pointing out what's what with these stocks. This is a very rigid stock. This is the 450 Bushmaster model. I should say that maybe some of these or all of these are available with wood stocks now. I know the Tikka T3X is with the Hunter model, and maybe the American, and maybe even the 783. But the ones I run into in the woods and at the range, they all look like these. The synthetic stocks, I think, outsell the wood stocks by a wide margin, partly because of cost and partly because they don't show use as readily. So there gives you a good idea of what the stocks look like, and we'll do this for the Axis and other rifles. I'll just set these aside so we can go back to them if we need to. This is the Tikka T3 magazine. By now we all know this is a durable, completely acceptable magazine, but when you handle it, it feels like a piece of junk, but it's not. That's just perception. It works very well. The follower is a polymer. I've never tested these for heat, primarily because when are these exposed to extreme heat? Even if you're in Africa, it's not going to be over 200 degrees, maybe approaching that temperature. The T3 magazine, this one is the Ruger American. It's in 450 Bushmaster, so it's a little bit misleading because the magazine for the 308 is a rotary magazine. For the Bushmaster, they offer this completely polymer magazine, but it's pretty tough. It's a strong magazine. I'd say it's as good as the T3, and I'm sure that they do the same thing we're doing here. They look at the other guy's product because they all have the same technical and manufacturing quote-unquote difficulties to overcome. So how to overcome them in an economical way, make a product that looks good and works. And then here's the 783 magazine, which to me is the nicest of the magazines. It still retains some steel. It's got a good feeling to it. The bottom is polymer, and the retention system is very good. I looked at that closely. It's going to be hard to talk about that in detail because you almost have to have a hands-on situation with how these magazines feel when they're being pressed into the stock. And so those are the magazines. Now this is the 783 trigger guard, which is a separate piece from the stock, so that's self-evident. It just fits in here. And we already talked about the Ruger American. The trigger guard is part of the stock. And on the Tikka, if you look closely, they made this assembly. They made one polymer piece, including the trigger guard, and then they pressed it in to the polymer stock, because casting this all as one unit can be done, but when you do that, depending on what system you're using, and I don't want to get bogged down in talking about injection molding and so on, but it ends up looking like the Ruger American, which you can see has kind of a streamlined look to get the trigger guard in here. You've got a mold line here down the center of the trigger guard. It has a more, let's say, unsophisticated look because they had to do it in one shot. The Tikka, they made a separate component and then pressure fit, and I'm assuming either glued or heat bonded the trigger guard and magazine mortise into the overall polymer stock. And you people who know all these things better than I do can send comments if I'm making mistakes, but I try to get it about correct. So there are the stocks, and this I put on the table just to kind of confuse the issue. This is a Mauser 98 bolt because that's where the whole thing started. And here we'll go to the Ruger American. So what can I say? The barrel is threaded in. I'm not sure if this is a locking shoulder. It could be. There could be clever techniques that they've used. So this may be similar to a collar as you'd see on a Savage 99 or on the Remington 783, which we'll look at in a moment. The triggers, I don't take apart triggers, so I can't tell you about the insides of this trigger. All these triggers work, and I think it's actually better to leave these mechanisms alone. It has the tab like the Savage, and as far as creep and over travel, I couldn't find fault with any of these triggers, but I'm very accommodating when it comes to triggers because I can shoot my antique rifles, which have tremendous amounts of creep and over travel, and I just get used to the trigger. But that may be just me. And here's the bolt. So it's a 3-lug bolt on the Ruger American. Actually, I'll do the same thing as I did with the magazines. Now the 783. To remove the 783, there's a little tab here. Again, this is going to be hard for the camera crew. You may not see it, but if you own one, you'll recognize it right away, and you just push that forward and the bolt comes out. There's the 783 bolt. and the Tikka T3. These all are variations of an original Mauser 98, which has an even nicer component than any of these. But on the T3 you simply push here and there's your bolt. So you can get a good look at how they all dealt with locking the action, which is the main issue with all these. The T3 has uniquely shaped lugs. The main idea with lugs is this surface here. This is what actually holds all the bolt actions closed. This surface here and this surface here. And on the Ruger you have 3 lugs. Now it used to be possible to consult a table, which I had, but I don't have it anymore, and somebody went to the trouble of calculating this area and this area and this area just to determine how much actual locking surface. Naturally, if any or all of these failed, the only thing that will hold the bolt in is the bolt handle if it happens to lock into the action. So which can be like a safety lug. Now, the Mauser 98, you can see the locking lug surface area here, and of course Mauser knew that sometimes things went wrong and so included this safety lug plus the handle locked into the action. So I always reference the Mauser 98 simply because of its excellence. So we have, as far as machining goes, all of them are very well machined. Some of these may be using some of that new powdered steel and sintering technology, but I can't speak to that because I'm not familiar with it. The 783 reminds me of the Remington 700, which is no surprise, and you can see these pins. So if you get these pins out, then you can remove the bolt head, and these bolt heads float. Now when I say float, that doesn't mean you can manipulate them easily with your hand, but it's not a bad idea actually to have a bolt head that under the pressure, under the camming pressure of locking, comes into full contact with the base of the cartridge. Otherwise you have excess headspace, which is not a good thing, because that means the cartridge can move backwards. The 3 lugs of the Ruger American are excellent, and I believe that the Ruger American is the only one that has dual cocking cams. I can't show you those because they're inside the bolt, but what that means is the force of raising the bolt is distributed over a broader camming area, which makes opening the bolt easier. With a 3-lug bolt, there's less bolt radius, there's less to lift, which is why the bolt ends up open, you know, about here, whereas the Remington, in order to open you have to move here. So then you have scope interference and so forth, other things to consider. The Tikka also is a typical Mauser 98 bolt motion because of 2 locking lugs. So to get into the unlocked position, you have to make that full motion, but with the 3-lug bolt, you don't. You're unlocked already earlier. Anyhow, quite interesting to look at these bolts, and really bravo to all 3 manufacturers. Tikka is excellent. They have this unique way of attaching the bolt handle, which is quite rigid. Ruger goes directly into the bolt body, and the handle comes out the other side, as you can see. And the Remington 783, if this is a sintered product, I don't know. I can't tell. Maybe you can tell me. There is some evidence of some kind of brazing potentially here, but I can't tell whether that's brazing or not. You can see a line. To me it looks like maybe it is brazing. Anyway, they all work. Remington opted for this very unusual eccentric bolt handle or bolt knob. I don't know why they did this. But the newer models, the heavy barrel, has a very good looking and functioning bolt handle. Not that this doesn't work, it works. But I don't know what you think about this coin kind of shape. And here's the Ruger American and the Tikka T3. And then we'll set these aside. And the camera crew is really good at kind of scanning things as I mutter away here in the background. So you've got stocks. I hope you can keep track of everything. So Tikka T3, Ruger American, Remington 783. This is I should keep the same order. There's the T3 bolt, Ruger American, Remington 783, and Tikka T3 mag, Ruger American, and Remington 783. And then to spoil the show, I put the Mauser 98, which makes all of these things look pretty bad. Anyway, here's the Tikka T3 action and trigger. And again, I know I just said this, but I don't study these internals. This is a very clean looking action, and everybody knows this is rigid and excellent. The T3X has a slightly larger opening, and I think that's a good idea because it's hard to get at cartridges with this tight opening. The Ruger American is a very rigid action. You can see the, in a way, ancestry. I think a lot of these inexpensive rifles looked to the T3 for some key design elements, and this is in 450 Bushmaster, and it has the same way of anchoring the stock and dealing with recoil here and here in 4 places. And on the T3, as I showed you a moment ago, that's it right there. Remington opted for the tried and true recoil lug. So this piece is trapped between the barrel and this collar. Some people call it a barrel nut, and you need a spanner wrench to take this on and off. But this system is better than their old 770 or whatever it was in 710, where they used hydraulic pressure to just force the barrel into the receiver ring. If you want to change the barrel, you just take this nut off, and the recoil lug will fall free. And this is a very good system, obviously more massive than the Tikka, and I'm not sure it has more area than the Ruger, just because the Ruger has 4 surfaces. And again, Remington opted for the very tight loading port. And you can see the triggers. Of course, they're entirely different components, made differently, and the parts are totally different, but they look about the same. And undoubtedly, compared to a Winchester Model 70 trigger, which has now I'm talking about the classic design, there is no housing to the trigger. You can see the trigger components and clean them or whatever you want to do with them. Same with the Mauser 98. To me, that's the preferred system. But we're talking about production on an entirely different scale with the modern rifles. Mauser 98, they could make the gun or the action properly because of the way economies worked at that time. What else do I have to show you? Well, the Remington came with this scope. It doesn't have any names on it. I talked about this in another video. I'm not sure it came with these excellent Butler Creek lens caps. I like them a lot, but I mean, don't quote me, because maybe somebody put them on afterwards. For the channel, I try to buy used rifles that are in as new condition. Oh, I wanted to point out, I did show you on the stocks, but here are the bolts that hold these together. I did this deliberately. So for the 783s, you got one here, way back. On the Ruger, here and here. And on the 780, sorry, I've got them backwards. That's the 783. This is the Tikka. And I tried to keep them in order. The reason I got confused is they're similar on the Tikka here and the 783. They're quite far apart. And that was really the only reason that I'm talking about them. I actually, when I took these rifles apart, I like this Ruger American. I think they've done a good job with everything. And some of the components don't look as good. They're not as aesthetically pleasing, maybe, as other designs. The Remington has sort of a conventional appeal to it. Even this shoulder doesn't look too bad. It adds kind of a complexity and it looks all right. But I have to say the Ruger American is a pretty impressive rifle. And this one in 450, this one I've had at the range. Bushmaster is 450 Bushmaster caliber, and it shoots like a house on fire. But the Tikka and the 783, they're no slouches. We all know that, generally speaking, they shoot very well. There's always going to be an exception. One or another rifle won't shoot well of the same type, model, and everything else, and that's why you have to buy a rifle that maybe has a good chance of being excellent and hope that you got one. That's probably all I can say. This, in case the camera bounced off this, it's a Night Force scope. I have nothing to do with these people, but I buy their scopes. Excellent scope. I have this on the 450 Bushmaster. It has a floating reticle. I think you call that an etched reticle, and it's also illuminated. So they don't obviously again they don't make it anymore, but but I like that. And I was going to talk to you about my Savage 99 stock, but probably I'll make another video. So I hope that's useful to you. All the people that wrote me about the Axis, we're going to look at the Axis. Like I said, it's coming, and a couple of the other newer ones. We looked at the Marlin XS7 from memory. Could have gotten that wrong. But that is it. So quite a bit to cover, but hopefully informative. Thank you very much for watching. We'll go on to make another video.